Hello everyone and welcome to this video about how to create pivot tables in Excel. I'm Philip Burton and I have over 250,000 students in my best-selling courses on Udemy. Well, I've got a previous video which explains why pivot tables. So I explained what a pivot table is. So this is an example of a pivot table. Why it is the first weapon in my Excel armory when I receive a lot of data. And we also had a quick introduction to how to create pivot tables, including recommended pivot tables, which could save you a little bit of time when you receive new data. Now, in this video, what I'm going to do is describe in more detail how to create pivot tables, including what condition your initial data needs to be in, and then how you can expand it together with pivot charts in order to create an Excel dashboard. So first of all, what format should your data be in? Well, to start with, you need some data. So it could be sales data, it could be financial data. For this video, I'm using data about audio files with columns for file name, album, size, and date purchased. The data you use must be divided into rows and columns. Each row needs to be about something different but related. So in my data, each row is about a different audio file. Each column needs to describe a row in a consistent way. So for example, in my data, I have a numeric column for an ID number. I have a text column for file name and album name, and I have a date time column for date purchase. And I don't have any overlap between the columns. For example, I don't have any file names in column D or any dates in column A. Each column has a specific purpose. In addition to this, the first row in your data needs to describe what each album represents. It needs to have row headings, such as file name, album, size, date purchased. It needed to be the top row of a spreadsheet, but it does need to be the first row of your data. Now, in my version, I have my row headings in a different color and font, but that's not required. Now, there should be no merged cells. Merged cells means that here we have something in between columns B and C. Well, which column is it in for the pivot table? Excel might not know. There should ideally be no gaps in the rows or columns. So let's say I needed a gap here for presentation purposes. Well, I could have that without actually having a gap. What I would do is I would put something short as a heading, and then I would ensure that the background color is the same as the foreground color, so you couldn't actually see it. So to Excel, that is not a gap. Equally, I wouldn't have any gaps in your rows. One problem is that Excel might just take up to the gap as your data, so we'll be missing all of the rest of the data. Either that or your empty row will actually be included, but it would be included as if it was actually data. The file name would be shown as blank. Neither of these situations are ideal, so I would avoid gaps in the data. So let's create a pivot table. And before creating the pivot table, I would actually highlight the source data. If you don't, then Excel is going to guess where the source data range actually is and may get it wrong. This is especially the case if there are gaps in the data. So let's create a pivot table by highlighting the range and then going to Insert, Pivot Table, and then clicking OK. So after doing this, a new spreadsheet has been created in our Excel workbook. It contains the outline of a pivot table on the left-hand side, and there's a new pane on the right-hand side with the pivot table fields at the top and 4 areas below it. So from here, we can create our first analysis by dragging a field down. Let's drag down the album field to the rows area. And if you wanted the analysis going across instead of down, you could drag it to the columns area instead. From just a simple drag of a field, you can see an analysis, and we see that we've got around 20 albums. At this stage, we have no idea how many rows each album is in the data. So let's drag the album field down again, but this time into the values area. So now you can see the number of times each album occurs in my dataset. 10 Romantic Works occurs 15 times. The next question I can ask is, What is the album's size in bytes? To answer this, we can drag the size field down to the values area as well. It's looking good, but let's change the question. Instead of having each album's file size as a total, let's ask what is the smallest size per album. To answer this question, I can click on the drop-down next to sum of size, select Value Field Settings, and then in the new dialog box, change the sum summarization to min and click OK. Success. I can also add the max of size as well. To do this, I drag this size field again to the values area and I change it from sum of size to max of size in the same way. This is starting to look like a useful analysis. Now suppose you expanded your data source, adding an extra 1,000 rows. Well, the problem is that the pivot table doesn't know that you have done this, and it's going to refer to the same rows that you had when you created the pivot table. Now to change the data range that your pivot table should use, click inside the pivot table and go to Pivot Table, Analyze, Change Data Source. In Excel 2010 or earlier, then this was called Pivot Table Tools, Options, Change Data Source. A dialog box will then appear with the current range highlighted. You can now update the data source range. So let's update it to start down here and go all the way up to the top. Now, if I was routinely expanding my data, then I should consider converting my existing range to an Excel table. To do this, I would highlight the data and go to Insert tab, Table, and click OK. New pivot tables can use this table object, and you can change the data source of existing pivot tables as well. So it now says Table 1. Because the pivot table is now linked to a table which can automatically expand instead of a range which doesn't automatically expand often, your pivot table will be always linked to this correct number of rows. So when you refresh the pivot table, you'll get the updated analysis. So let's change the albums. Here we go. And we're going to now refresh the pivot table. And you can see that the number of albums has increased. So I'm just going to undo that, going to refresh the pivot table again, and again you can see that the number of albums has changed again. Now it might be useful to find out what each of these count of album figures are as a percentage of all of the data. You can do this with formulas, but you can also do it in the pivot table itself. First of all, let's remove min of size and max of size analyses by dragging them out of the values area. Now I could also have done this by clicking on it and going to Remove Field. Now let's drag the album field again into the values area, which makes a second count of album. We can then click on this new field in the values area and go to Value Field Settings again. Now there are two tabs in this Value Field Settings dialog box. By clicking on this second tab, I can change how this measure is calculated. So in this second tab, let's change the method of calculation by clicking on percentage of grand total. You might also want to change this field's name in the custom name settings. So let's call this percentage of total and click OK. By doing this, we can see what percentage each album's entries are as a percentage of the whole. Now there are lots of other calculations which can be done using this second tab, and it's worth exploring this tab when creating advanced pivot tables. We can also create a graph or chart based on this pivot table. To do this, all we have to do is click inside the pivot table and go to Insert Chart and select the type of chart that we want to insert. The pivot table and pivot chart are interlinked, so any changes I make to the pivot table are reflected in my pivot chart and vice versa. So you can see we've got these two fields here. In this example, I'm going to remove count of album from my pivot table by dragging it out of the values area. Notice what happens to the pivot table and pivot chart. So having done so, this field is also removed from the pivot chart as well. You can also filter data. For example, I've got a typographical error in our list of albums, as a musical offering has been misspelled. So I could correct it in the source data. I can group similar items together in the pivot table, which I did in my previous video, but I can also remove it for my analysis. To do this, I click on the drop-down arrow next to the row labels in my pivot table, and I can uncheck this item. So now this item has been removed in my pivot table and my pivot chart. Now in my previous video, I also categorized these into various groups. So I put both of the operas together, for example, and I put the audio guide by itself. And I did this to create a new field called album type. So this first type is music, this second type is opera, and this third type is audio. So having grouped these albums together, what if I want to just look at one particular album? Well, I could drag the album type, which I'm going to rename by clicking on an album type, going to Data Table, Analyze, Active Field, and renaming it. So I could drag it into the filters area of the pivot table. In older versions of Excel, this used to be called the page section. This area allows me to use a drop-down list to restrict what is being shown. So I'm going to restrict it to opera, for instance. So let's just undo that. However, there is a much more user-friendly interface, which was introduced in Excel 2010, and it's called the slicer. To add a slicer, click anywhere inside the pivot table and go to Pivot Table Analyze, Filter, Insert Slicer, and select the field that you want to slice. Well, I want to slice on the album type. This then shows a slicer which contains the values in this field. You can then click on any one of them, or more than one if you want, by holding down Control, to filter the pivot table. For me, it is a more user-friendly way than having to go to the filters area, and much more useful when creating a dashboard. A dashboard generally includes more than one analysis. Let's create a second pivot table in exactly the same way that we created the first pivot table, and we're going to have it in the same spreadsheet. So right here. This pivot table, I'm going to have the year of date purchased in the field area in the rows, and we're going to have count of albums in the values. So it's added some extra fields. I'm going to get rid of them. I just want the years. And we're going to create a pie chart based on this. So let's drag this pivot table down and insert a pie chart. Now our analysis is starting to look a bit like a dashboard. Unfortunately, the slicer only affects one pivot table, not both. So if I click on opera, for instance, it will only affect one of the pivot tables. There's 2 items shown here, but we still have all 253 rows shown in the second pivot table. To allow a slicer to affect multiple pivot tables at the same time, then right and click on the slicer and go to Report Connections. Currently, there is only one pivot table which is checked. When we check both pivot tables and click OK, then the slicer is now connected to both pivot tables. So when we change the selection in the slicer, both the pivot tables and the pivot charts change. we've now created a working dashboard in Excel. Let's develop it further by inserting a timeline. This feature was introduced in Excel 2013. To insert a timeline, then we go to PivotTable, Analyze, Insert Timeline. Excel then shows all of the available date fields. So I've clicked on Date Purchase field and then OK. So we've got this new timeline. As with the slices, we can right and click on the timeline and select Report Connections to restrict it and connect it to both PivotTables and PivotCharts. So now we can graphically restrict the dates ranges in both PivotTables. Let's restrict it to 2010, for instance, or 2009 and 2010. So we can look at a single year, or we can drill down into by quarter, by month, and by day. Well, thank you for watching this video. However, there is a lot more functionality to explore in PivotTables. My course, Analyzing and Visualizing Data in Microsoft Excel, contains over 6 hours of PivotTables and PivotCharts videos. There are plenty of practice activities, so you can be sure that you are learning. And it also contains hours of videos on Get and Transform and Power Pivot, which will take your use of Excel to the next level. If you thought PivotTables were good, wait until you see what's here. If this sounds of interest to you, why not have a look at my course now and see what you can learn. Thank you very much for watching this, and keep learning.